So, with a name like Pouliopoulos, many of you probably assume correctly that I am of Greek descent. I am the son of Greek immigrants. This is my father, Fotios Pouliopoulos, on the left-hand side of the screen, and my mother, Pelagia Dinopoulos, on the right-hand side of the screen. They were married in 1958. It was an arranged marriage, which was the custom at the time. Imagine that. It was an arranged marriage. And I think the arrangement has been a success. Yes, let's give him a hand, right? So, as a Greek American growing up in the United States, my life was a lot like a lot of scenes from that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. This is me. I think I was about 3 or 4 years old. I had such great hair back then. And I like to tell people it wasn't my big fat Greek wedding necessarily. I had one of those, but it was also my big fat Greek childhood, right? So during the day, I spent, like everyone else, going to public school, but at night, 2 to 3 times a week for 2 hours every session, I went to Greek school. So we'd go to the Greek church, and I learned how to speak Greek, how to write Greek, how to read Greek. I learned about Greek culture. I learned about Greek mythology. We learned Aesop's fables. We learned how Plato was Socrates' teacher, and Socrates was Aristotle's teacher, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. I learned all of this in the form of stories, which I really enjoy quite a bit. So for a very long time, to whoever would listen, I would tell them that life is about the stories we can tell. You can tell that I enjoy telling a story or two. If you've ever taken a class of mine, you know that one of the best ways to get me to drift away from the topic at hand is to ask me to tell a story, and I'll do that every single time. One of the things that I've noticed, though, in working both with students and with business professionals is that we often discount the ability for us to choose the stories we're going to tell. You know, there's always this thought that you can make a decision in your life about what direction you want to go in and what you want to do in life, and yet I find that so many people sort of let that power go. They give it up to other folks all too often. And when you survey people that are close to retirement age, they'll tell you 80 to 90% of the time they were miserable in the jobs they had. Somewhere along the line, we give up the power to make choices about the stories we want to tell in our lives. And I think part of the problem is we sometimes think it's a linear opportunity. We think it's a linear path from high school to college to career to retirement and all the parts in between. And you know that's not the case. You know that no matter what you do, every day you make thousands of decisions that could change the course of your life, whether you know it or not. Little things that can happen to you along the way that disrupt this linear path and change it. And really what you end up with is wherever you are, at whatever point in time you are at, today for example, everything that has happened before you, all the stories that you've been able to tell, all the experiences that you've had, have led you to this point. And we talk about coalescence, right? You are the coalescence of all the stories that you are able to tell that have brought you to this point. The good news is, going forward, you have a blank page. Every decision you make from this point forward is an opportunity to tell a different story. But you have to take advantage of that, and you have to think about every decision you make in terms of the stories we can tell. So one of my favorite quotes is the following: life is not about the number of days you live, it's about the number of days you remember. Ask yourself how many days you remember, truly remember from the past month, and how many days do you truly remember from the past year? I guarantee you for most people it's just a handful. Why? Because most of the days that we live tend to fall into some kind of a routine. We tend to sort of get a little foggy. We tend to drift through decision after decision. We kind of do what's expedient, but we don't often think about how we can change what we're doing or try something new. I think the days that you remember, think about one of those days that you remember. It's probably because of an interesting story you can tell about that day. And so what I want to do for you now, just briefly, is tell you about 6 days that I remember from 1989. 6 days that I think have a huge impact on my life and hopefully will be informative to you. This is my family. On the lower right-hand corner are my grandparents, Demetrius and Despina Pouliopoulos. Demetrius was a bit of an entrepreneur and an inventor. He actually saved enough money to create the first mechanized wheat mill in the village where my grandparents and my father and all our relatives grew up. But it's the man toward the left who's sitting who's the subject of this story. This is my Uncle Lazarus. Uncle Lazarus was 15 years older than my father, and he worked for most of his life in the mill, in the village. In other words, people would bring him wheat, and he would create flour. And that was sort of the family business. So we were the millers. And not only that, but my uncle was also a merchant. So he would take his donkey and he would travel across the countryside and he would buy interesting products and goods and he'd bring them back, and he opened up a little store. And the little store was the general store in the center of town where everyone went to buy everything they needed. And it became kind of a social gathering place as well. So he was a miller, he was a merchant. Oh, by the way, he was a musician as well. When he was a young man, this is him on the right-hand side playing the violin. When he was a young man, he really wanted to learn how to play the violin. He had a great ear for music. He begged with his father to let him leave the mill for a month and go work. And go take classes, music classes, and not work. And my grandfather refused and refused and refused, and finally he gave in and said, look, I'll give you the month off, but I can't pay you. I can't give you any money to pay for the music lessons. And he says, all right, I'll just bring some bags of wheat flour with me, and I will pay for my music lessons with flour. So he literally loaded up a donkey, and he just kind of paid for his music lessons with bags of flour. And he became quite a good musician. After that 1 month of lessons, he actually became a roving wedding band player. So he would put together bands of gypsies, literally, and they would go from village to village, and they would play for all the weddings. And he told me once that he made more money as a musician than he ever did as a merchant or a miller. So this was my Uncle Lazarus, and my brother and I went to Greece in 1989, and we spent about 6 days in the village with this man. He was, in so many ways, an older reflection of me. We used to sit and tell stories to each other. He used to tell me about the old days, and I used to tell him about the new country, and it was just a very magical 6-day period of time. We spent most of our time in his little general store. So through these 2 doors, I would get there in the morning, I would have a little bit of breakfast, we'd sit down, we'd talk. Next thing you know, I could start to smell the shish kebab cooking, and he'd bring out some feta cheese and some bread, and we'd sit and we'd talk and we'd eat, and we'd talk some more and tell some more stories and laugh. We'd laughed a lot. And then around noontime, my uncle would disappear for a moment out back and come back with a bottle of clear liquid. Because in addition to being a miller and a musician and a merchant, turns out my uncle was a moonshiner. And he would make these wonderful versions of this thing called raki, which is kind of like ouzo, but doesn't taste as good and is stronger. And these 2 bottles are mine. I have these at home. These are probably the last 2 bottles in existence of my Uncle Lazarus's raki, but it was very powerful stuff, as you can see. There was a lot of dancing in the general store and a lot of violin playing. So this was my uncle, Uncle Lazarus, and I spent these 6 wonderful days with him, and towards the end of it, he cried. And I figured he was crying because he was sad, and I asked him, what's wrong? Why are you crying? And it wasn't that he was sad so much. He said, I'm crying tears of joy because you're the first Pouliopoulos I've met that I could actually drink raki with and drink so much with. Your dad was kind of a lightweight, he said. I said, okay, that's great. I'll take that compliment. But then, of course, there was the sadness of leaving the village and realizing that, it was time to go. So I promised him, I said, listen, this has been just an amazing period of time for me, and I'm going to come back. I'm promising you that I will come back, and we will tell more stories, and we will drink more raki, and we'll have a great time. So I would love to tell you the story about the time I went back, and he taught me how to make raki and how to build my own still in back of my home. I would love to tell you the story about the time when we looked inside his violin and noticed that there was an inscription that said Antonio Stradivarius. And we wondered if that was for real or a knockoff. But I can't tell you those stories because in 2011, my dad called me one day to tell me, your uncle is gone. Uncle Lazarus passed away. And, when anyone passes away in a family, there's a sense of mourning and loss, of course. But for me, that moment, the emotion that struck me was not so much the mourning and the loss, but it was the sense of regret. It was like a combination of shame and anger. How could 22 years have gone by after I'd made this promise to my uncle, and I didn't go back and visit him. We talked on the phone maybe a handful of times over that period of time, but my Greek was kind of okay, and he didn't speak English, and it really wasn't the same thing. 22 years passed, and I never had a chance to sit down and have another piece of shish kebab and another drink of raki. And so it occurs to me that when we have regrets that are that strong, they are really just the echoes of the stories we can't tell. A regret is just the echo of a story you can't tell. I can't tell you the story about the time that we realized it said Antonio Stradivarius in the violin, although it's true, someone else had that experience. I can't tell you about the time I learned how to make raki, although other people have learned how to do that, working with my uncle. So you ask yourself, how do 22 years go by like that when something that seems that important doesn't happen? And I think there are two reasons that things like that happen to all of us, and I'm sure all of you feel regret over something in your life. The first thing is alarms go off in your life and you hit the snooze button. So if you've ever slept through a class, and I know some of you have, what happens is you hear the alarm, you hit the snooze button, and you've got a few minutes to sleep some more. This is what alarms sound like in the real world. If you're a business owner, a spouse might say to you, I never see you anymore. You work so many hours, you work on the weekends, we're drifting apart, I don't know what's going on. This is the snooze button. I'll spend time with her or him when the busy season's over. I promise we'll go away for a weekend when I have some time. I'll promise, I promise, I promise. And then the snooze button and the alarm stops ringing. If you're a parent, sometimes it's a complaint that you're not spending time enough with your children. And the snooze button sounds like, I'll sign up to coach T-ball next year. I'll sign up to volunteer for the drama club next year. I'll sign up, I'll do this, I promise, I promise, I promise. These are just little white lies that we're telling ourselves. In my case, my family, my wife, my children, my parents always said to me, when are you going to go back and see your uncle? You want to go back. You should go back before it's too late. I'll get to it when I'm not so busy. I'll get to it when I'm not so busy, when the time is right, when the time is right. But like every alarm clock in the world that has a snooze button, eventually the snooze button stops working, and you oversleep, and you've missed out. So don't ignore the alarms that go off in your life. The other reason is that life is like a record player, and for those of you who are too young to know what this is, I'll explain. In the outer ring, when a record is turning and you watch the needle, it looks like it's taken a pretty leisurely path around that record, playing that first song. As the second song comes in and the third and the fourth, that needle seems like it's moving a lot faster. The needle itself doesn't move any faster, it just looks faster because the circle is smaller. That's how every year of your life will pass. Because every year that you live means that every year that's left is a bigger percentage of the time you have left on this planet. There are 1,144 weeks in 22 years. During that period of time, I got married, I had 3 children, finished my MBA, changed jobs a couple times. Oh, by the way, I traveled a lot. I was in England, Germany, Italy, Australia, Japan. We traveled all over the world for business and on vacation. And not once did I set aside 1 week to spend time with my uncle. So I learned a lot from this situation. I learned that if you ask people that are dying what they regret most in life are the following things. And I'll let you read those, but I want you to pick up on this one pattern. The thing that most people regret the most always begins with the sentence, I wish I had. I wish I had done this, I wish I had done that, I wish I had made this decision, I wish I had, I wish I had, I wish I had. Regardless of what comes after that, your regret almost always starts with a statement about an action or a decision you didn't make. How do you leverage it when it happens to you? Write about it. For 30 years, I've kept a personal journal, and I find that almost all the time when I have some kind of a difficult period of time, an emotional period of time, if I spend time writing in that journal, it usually helps me slow my thoughts down and figure out what went wrong, how much did I actually have control over it, what am I going to do differently next time? Learn from it, right? There's an old saying, you only make a mistake once, the second time is a choice. Fix it. If right now you're thinking about an aunt, an uncle, a brother, a sister, a family member, an old friend that you think you should have been calling or staying in touch with, then tonight or tomorrow, pick up the phone and make a call. Fix it. You can make up for it. And then share it. In my case, I wanted to do this talk today so that I could share the story of my Uncle Lazarus as a way of honoring him. And a funny thing happened on the way to the talk. As I was preparing and looking for old pictures and interviewing my dad and trying to get some more information about this, I came across 90 minutes of a recorded video interview that someone had done with my uncle on YouTube, of all places. That was done in like 2008. They were commemorating a big anniversary in the village, and they were interviewing him about his role in managing and running the mill all those years. And it was all the raw footage from the interview. It was 90 minutes of stories and insights, and he played the violin. It was amazing. I shared that with my father, and we both cried. It was just an amazing experience, and it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't decided to share this story with you today. There's an old saying, don't die with the music inside of you. And that means that each of you has a gift, each of you has a talent, each of you has a strength, each of you has something to give the world. You just got to figure out what it is. So get busy figuring that out. My uncle was 95 years old when he passed away. His mind was clear. He was fine. He was just old. His body was just old. And he fell asleep and never woke up. And that is really the best way to go. But if you were to ask him when he took his final breath, I guarantee you he would have said, I don't owe the world anything. I gave them all my music, literally and figuratively. He did everything he wanted to in life and died, I believe, a very happy man. So as I close this talk, I want to try to give you a gift on behalf of my uncle. I want you all to, for a moment, just close your eyes. Close your eyes and think about the following words. Imagine that you are 95 years old, and your body has aged, but your mind is clear and sharp. And you're sitting in a room surrounded by friends and family. Someone wheels in an enormous cake, and there's a lot of candles on it, and they sing happy birthday to you. And as the song comes to an end, someone says, blow out the candles and make a wish. And as you take in a big breath and blow out those candles, the wish that you make is the following. I wish I could come back to 2015 to tell my younger self the things I need to change before I regret them later in life. Now, as you open your eyes, I want you to think about those things, and I want you to feel the power of making a choice in your life. And sometime in the next 24 hours, I want you to take one small action to begin crafting a new story for yourself. Life is about the stories you can tell. What will be your stories? Thank you.